The dry wind carried dust between the scrub oaks when Jake, machete in hand, pushed aside some branches and came upon something that shouldn't have been there. A strange nest, woven not with twigs or thorns, but with coarse ropes that looked like tanned hide. The blood was visible when you touched it and felt that it still held moisture, as if it had been placed there that same morning. He looked around. The hill was empty. Not a bird's cry, not an insect's buzz, just silence. He tucked this secret deep in his bag, not knowing that this decision would drag us into nights of stealthy footsteps, boarded-up windows, and a fear that would soon transform into sacrifice. Jake lived in a small adobe house built by hand, as if each brick contained not only sun-hardened mud but also the memory of his father, who had taught him to shape them. The tin roof patched with pieces of cardboard and stones on top so the wind wouldn't carry it away. It let out a metallic groan every time the north wind blew strong. The walls, cracked by humidity, displayed scars from years of neglect. And yet, that shack remained standing, like an old man who refuses to fall. Its interior was poor, a cot with a worn mattress that smelled of dust and sweat, an unstable wooden table where 2 plates barely fit, and a stove where beans seemed to boil eternally, always accompanied by hard tortillas. There were no luxuries, hardly the essentials for survival. But Jake had a deep attachment to that space because he was born there. There he had heard his mother's laughter, and there he had buried his childhood memories. It was his little world surrounded by furrows of arid land, a corral with some scrawny chickens, and the certainty that a farmer's life is not measured by what one owns, but by what one is capable of enduring. Jake's days were always the same and yet different moments in his silent sacrifice. He would rise before the rooster crowed, when the dawn chill gnawed at his bones and the silence of the countryside was so dense that even the crickets seemed to hush. He walked to the hill with an empty bag and the machete slung over his shoulder, looking for dry wood among the scrub oaks. With each step, the ground creaked under his worn boots and the air smelled of moist earth when luck brought dew. With the wood on his shoulder, he returned when the sun barely touched the horizon line, and at that moment he would stop to watch the sunrise as if it were a private show only he could witness. At home, he would dump the wood near the stove, feed the chickens with counted grains, and check the traps he had set among the bushes to catch rabbits. He didn't talk to anyone, but sometimes he muttered words into the air, convinced that his mother was listening from wherever she was. He asked for strength, he asked for patience, and he also asked not to be left to fall into despair. He was a man accustomed to silence, and that silence, though he embraced it, was also his greatest punishment. His loneliness weighed like a sack of stones. He had brothers, yes, but they had all migrated to the city in search of something better. Factories, construction, trucking. They said there was no future in the countryside, and staying there was a waste of youth. Jake thought differently. Someone had to take care of what remained of the family lands, even if they were just a few hectares cracked by drought. Many times he secretly regretted it, especially when he saw his neighbors loading trucks full of harvest to go to market, while he could barely fill a sack of corn with small, irregular ears. But every time the sun set and the sky turned orange, he remembered what his father had told him. A man can lose everything except the root that sustains him. And that root was there, in that piece of arid land, in those stones he had stepped on as a child, in that cross that marked his mother's grave. He knew that city life would have given him a firmer roof, perhaps more abundant food, but it never would have given him the peace of feeling like an owner, even if it was in a forgotten corner of the world. At night, when the heat began to give way, Jake would sit in a broken chair in front of his house with his gaze lost on the horizon. The countryside wore colors that changed every minute, from intense yellow to bright orange, then to deep violet, and finally to a dark blue that seemed to swallow everything. It was in those moments that the silence of the countryside became sinister. He could hear the stones cooling with a soft click, the crickets singing again, and how the air seemed to stop just before the first stars appeared. Sometimes, looking toward the hill, a strange sensation ran through him, as if someone else was watching him from the thicket. A shiver ran down his spine, and instinctively he would put more wood in the stove, seeking the warmth of the fire as refuge. Then he convinced himself that it was all his imagination, a product of fatigue. But deep in his heart, in that corner where the oldest fears are kept, he knew the hill hid secrets. The village elders repeated it. The hill is never alone. So Jake's life passed, simple, silent, full of invisible sacrifices and seemingly eternal routines. There was no sound of engines, no voices, no celebration, just the breathing of the earth and the slow passage of time. However, fate was already waiting for him with a trap, because one afternoon, looking for wood deeper than usual, his steps led him to a corner where the hill kept something that shouldn't be seen. What he found there would change his life forever, forcing him to close doors, board up windows, and live with a secret that few men would have endured without losing their minds. The afternoon sun was strong when Jake decided to go a little further than normal into the hills in search of wood that could last several days. The dry drought wood had become scarce near his ranch, so he advanced along paths that almost no one traveled, between mesquites with twisted branches and thorny bushes that grew like green walls. With each step, he felt the air becoming thicker, full of that restless silence, a silence where not even birds dare to sing. The machete in his hand gave him security, though he didn't expect to encounter anyone, as it was rare for a neighbor to venture so far. It was at that moment, while pushing aside some branches, that his eyes fell upon something that made him stop suddenly. A strange nest the size of a wagon wheel placed over an opening between two large stones. What shocked him was not the size, but the material it was made of. They weren't branches or dry grass, but ropes, braided fibers that looked like skin hardened by the sun. His heart jumped, and without thinking, he extended his hand to touch it. The rough, moist texture paralyzed him. It wasn't common rope, it wasn't anything he had ever seen before. Jake immediately stepped back, wiping his hand on his pants, as if he wanted to tear from his skin what he had just felt. He looked around, hoping to find some explanation. An old man who had left rope scraps, some animal that had dragged them there, anything that would calm the knot in his chest. But there was nothing, not a soul, not a trace of human presence. The air was still, and even the crickets seemed to have hidden. He crouched down again more carefully and noticed that small fragments of fabric were protruding between the fibers of the nest, like pieces of frayed clothes. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the cool breeze. His instinct told him to leave, but something stronger forced him to keep observing, as if that thing had an invisible power holding him. He didn't know how long he stayed there, eyes fixed on that impossible find, until he heard a creak in the distance, a faint sound of breaking branches. He turned abruptly, gripping the machete, but saw nothing. With his heart still beating hard, he stuffed a piece of that strange nest into his bag. He didn't know why he did it or what he would keep it for, but something inside him told him to take proof of what he had seen. Perhaps he wanted to convince himself that he wasn't imagining things, that it was real and not a product of fatigue. He returned with quick steps but without running, because the old folks always said that in the hills, you shouldn't show fear. With each step, he felt someone watching him, though when he turned his gaze, he only saw branches swaying in the wind. When he finally reached the edge of his land, he breathed a sigh of relief, as if he had left a place where he wasn't welcome. He stored the bag under the kitchen table, covering it with an old sack. That night he barely ate a piece, lying on his cot with his eyes open, listening to sounds that seemed new, distant footsteps, dogs barking in different directions, and the whistle of wind coming through the cracks in the windows. In the following days, Jake tried to convince himself that he should forget the matter. He continued with his routines, feeding the chickens, cleaning the coop, cutting dead branches. But every time he passed by the bag, the memory of the nest haunted him like a shadow. One morning, before the rooster crowed, he heard someone walking outside his house. They weren't quick or noisy steps, but slow, calculated, like someone who doesn't want to be discovered. Jake got up silently, grabbed the machete, and peered through a crack in the window. The moon was high, illuminating the patio with a pale glow. He swore he saw a silhouette in the bushes, motionless, staring at him. When he blinked, there was nothing there. He stood for a long time with the machete in his hand, not daring to go outside. The silence was so absolute that he could hear his heartbeat in his ears. On the third day, while working in the field, he noticed a strange truck parked in a gap a few meters from his land. It wasn't the neighbor's vehicle, nor the merchants who sometimes crossed there. It was a truck without license plates, painted a faded gray with windows covered by dark curtains. Jake hid behind some furrows and watched two men get out of the vehicle. They walked a few steps toward the hill and then returned without carrying anything. They didn't speak, didn't laugh, showed no haste. They just walked as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Then they got in the truck and left slowly, raising a cloud of dust that took time to settle. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. The memory of the nest, the footsteps outside, and now that truck without license plates formed a puzzle that anguished him. He felt he had gotten into something that was beyond him, and that the neighbor's silence was no coincidence. It was the first time Jake seriously thought about boarding up his windows. He wasn't a fearful man. He had survived storms, droughts, and had even faced coyotes that prowled his corral. But what he felt now wasn't common fear. It was a dark foreboding, a warning that urged him to protect himself. That night, he put old boards in the cracks, reinforced the door with a piece of wood across it, and lit the fire in the fireplace earlier than usual, as if the light could scare away what was approaching. Outside, the hill was absolutely silent, a silence that seemed to hold its breath hidden. Jake, sitting next to the machete, understood that this discovery had not been a coincidence. Something or someone had led him to that nest, and now that presence had marked him. Jake knew he couldn't live with the bag hidden under the table forever. Every time he entered the kitchen, he felt that piece of nest was looking at him, claiming him, calling him as if it had a life of its own. At first he thought of burning it, but something inside him stopped him. It seemed to him that if he did, he would be erasing evidence that sooner or later he might need. Other times he thought of taking it to the village and showing it to someone, perhaps the commissioner or the priest. But he immediately remembered the neighbors' suspicious looks, that suspicious silence when someone mentioned the hill, and he understood he would get no answers. Even so, doubt consumed him. Keep the secret and protect himself, or speak openly and risk awakening something greater than he knew. This was the first of many decisions that would mark his destiny, and each one involved sacrificing a piece of his tranquility. One afternoon, while arranging the corral, he saw old Henry, an elderly neighbor who rarely left his house, approaching. The man arrived slowly, leaning on his cane, and without even greeting him asked, "Have you seen anything strange on the hill?" Jake froze with the shovel in his hand, hesitating between answering or remaining silent. Finally, he shook his head, but the old man looked at him with tired eyes and said in a low voice, "If you happen to see something, don't say it out loud. They listen." Then he walked away as if nothing, leaving Jake with a chill on his back that not even the scorching sun could warm. That warning made him understand that he wasn't alone in his suspicions, that others knew but preferred to remain silent. And that certainty put him before a difficult choice: be part of the collective silence that protected everyone, or break it and expose himself to who knows what consequences. That same night, the bag began to emit a strange smell, a mixture of wet leather with rusty iron. Jake couldn't sleep. He kept getting up to check that nothing had moved, that the table remained in place, that the boards on the windows remained. At midnight, a dry sound made him jump from the cot. Someone knocked on the door, not like someone calling, but like someone testing the strength of the wood. He armed himself with his machete and waited, holding his breath. The silence lasted several minutes until the community dogs began barking in chain, as if they were chasing an invisible shadow. At that moment he realized he could no longer keep the bag, that he had to decide what to do with it before it dragged him into a darkness without return. At dawn he took the bag and walked toward old Henry's land. The old man greeted him with a tired expression, and seeing what Jake was carrying, shook his head in disapproval. "You've gotten into something you shouldn't have," he murmured, without even touching the piece of nest. He explained that for years some faceless men had appeared at night to collect things in the hills, strange objects that no one dared investigate. The neighbors learned to close their doors and not ask questions, because those who asked too many questions ended up disappearing. "If you want to stay alive, bury it far from home and don't talk about it anymore," he warned. Jake listened in silence, with a heavy heart, understanding that the decision was his: obey and remain silent, or keep the peace as evidence that something dark moved on his land. Returning home with the bag on his shoulder, Jake felt that each step sank him deeper into an inevitable destiny. As he crossed the corral, he looked up and realized he wasn't alone. At the top of the hill, a dark figure watched him motionless, a silhouette against the night sky. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a shadow, but he was sure it had been there for some time. Fear led him to run inside, lock the door, and put more boards on the windows. There, sitting by the fire, embracing the machete like a child, he realized that his choice wouldn't be between staying silent or speaking. His real choice would be between protecting his life in silence or sacrificing it for a truth that no one seemed to want to hear. The nights became unbearable in Jake's house. The wind blew differently, as if it carried hidden murmurs with it, and every creak of the wood made him jump from his cot. The bag stored under the table seemed like a silent enemy. Sometimes he swore he heard a slight movement inside, as if the fibers themselves were breathing. Outside, dogs barked at unusual hours, and more than once, Jake saw faint lights moving on the hill, headlights that suddenly went out, shadows walking where no one should be. The ranch, which had once been his refuge of peace, had transformed into a prison, and every crack in the house seemed like an eye through which they spied on him. He knew that sooner or later, those who were looking for that nest would know he possessed it, and with that thought, fear began to seep into his bones like a cold that wouldn't leave him even in full daylight. One afternoon, while carrying water from the well, he heard the roar of an engine approaching through the gap. A gray truck, the same one he had seen days before, was moving slowly, raising dust. Jake crouched behind a bush, holding the bucket with trembling hands, and watched as it stopped right in front of his land. Two tall men, dressed in dark clothes and shiny boots, got out of the cab. They weren't farmers, that was obvious. They moved with confidence like soldiers but without uniforms. They walked to the fence, inspecting with calculating eyes, and one of them pointed at Jake's house. The other nodded, and without saying a word they returned to the truck. What disturbed him most was that they hadn't knocked on the door or shouted his name. They had just looked at him, as if they already knew everything. When they left, Jake remained paralyzed with his heart hammering in his chest, certain that look was a warning, a notice that he was being watched. As night fell, he decided to bury the bag far from his house. He walked with a lantern in his hand, entering the field, choosing a place where the stones were hard and the ground difficult to dig. As he sank the shovel into the ground, he felt each blow echo like a bell in the darkness. He had taken a few steps when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned immediately with the lantern trembling in his hand, but found only hill and silence. Fear paralyzed him for a few seconds until he realized the lantern was beginning to go out, as if the wind was blowing directly on its flame. He covered the hole halfway, left the shovel behind, and ran back to the house with his heart about to explode. That night he would cover not only the windows but also the door with wooden beams. He knew it wasn't enough, but he needed to feel he still had control over something. At dawn, the tension exploded. A group of men in pickup trucks arrived. They weren't from the town. No one knew them, but they walked with firm steps toward the most isolated ranches. They knocked on doors, asked questions in low voices, and people responded with looks of terror. When they reached the edge of Jake's land, he watched hidden from the corral with the machete in his hand. The men inspected from a distance. One of them whistled, and they all returned to the trucks without even knocking on his door. They left raising a cloud of dust, but Jake understood the message. They were surrounding him, waiting for the right moment to act. It was no longer his imagination, no longer paranoia. They were looking for him, and what he had at home was the reason they wouldn't leave him alone. That night, Jake sat in front of the stove with his eyes fixed on the dancing, restless flame. He felt he needed to make a final decision. Either he handed over the nest, trusting they would leave him alone, or he prepared to defend his house to the end. The idea of running away crossed his mind several times, but he knew that abandoning the ranch was like tearing out his soul. He couldn't leave behind his father's land, his mother's memories, the work of his life. So, with contained tears and a clenched jaw, he took the machete and placed it beside him, ready to face whatever was coming. At that moment, he understood that the conflict was no longer with the men who pursued him, but with the very fear that tried to break him. And although he knew he might lose his life, he also understood there were things worse than dying, living subjugated, living in eternal silence. The dawn arrived heavy, laden with a painful silence. Jake had barely slept a few hours when a loud knock on the door shook him. It wasn't a polite human knock, but a strong, dry blow, as if testing the resistance of the wood he himself had nailed the night before. He remained motionless on his cot with the machete gripped in his hand, holding his breath as if that were enough to make him invisible. After the first blow, there was no other, just a slow scraping of footsteps on the ground, circling the house as if measuring its walls, as if marking territory. His heart hammered in his ears, and at that moment he understood it was no longer a matter of waiting for an attack, but of resisting it. However, doubt pierced him. Could one man alone, without weapons or help, contain what was coming? The day dawned with a strange sky, a pale gray that seemed like an omen. Jake went to the corral and found fresh footprints in the moist earth. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, heavy and deep ones that surrounded the house like warning circles. His chickens were restless, cackling as if they had been chased during the night. He felt an emptiness in his stomach. It was no longer a matter of distant surveillance. They had surrounded him completely. He tried to work in the field, cut some dry branches, clean the ditch, but his hands trembled. He couldn't concentrate, as every crack of a branch sounded like approaching footsteps. Every shadow made him turn abruptly with the machete in his hand. Doubt transformed into desperation, and desperation into a weight that bent him. At noon he saw old Henry arrive. The old man looked at him with tired eyes, but with a seriousness he had never seen before. "Now they know you have it," he said without beating around the bush. "If you don't hand it over, they'll come for you, and when they do, there'll be no way out." Jake swallowed hard, squeezing the bag he still kept under the table. "And if I hand it over, will they leave me alone?" he asked, almost pleading for an answer that would calm his anguish. The old man shook his head. "They never calm down. What they seek isn't just that. It's everyone's silence." That phrase was like a dagger to the chest. Handing over the nest wouldn't guarantee him anything, and staying silent made him an accomplice to a fear that had lived in the community for years. What to do then? All options seemed to condemn him. The afternoon fell without answers. Jake locked himself up early, covering the windows with old boards and securing the door with 2 pieces of wood. The stove was lit, but it didn't relieve his fear. He sat in front of the fire with glazed eyes, feeling loneliness crushing him more than ever. He thought of his mother, how she always told him a man shouldn't fear destiny, because life in the countryside was made of hard tests that had to be overcome. But this test was different. It wasn't drought. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't loss. It was something he didn't understand, something he couldn't name, and that uncertainty consumed him more than fear itself. He wondered if in reality he had already been lost from the moment he decided to take that piece of the nest. The night became dark and starless. The footsteps returned firmer, closer, surrounding the house like hungry wolves. Suddenly, a shocking blow shook the door, splintering nails and wood chips. Jake raised the machete with his accelerated pulse and trembling legs. He felt as if he was seconds away from losing everything. Doubt became unbearable. Should he open up and face whatever came, or resist locked up like a cornered animal? In that moment of tense silence before the next blow, he knew destiny had already chosen for him, and that the worst was yet to come. The blow that had shaken the door didn't repeat, and that sudden silence was more terrifying than any thunder. Jake remained with the machete trembling in his hand while the fire in the stove crackled, illuminating his sweaty face. Minutes that seemed eternal passed until he heard a murmur outside, a whisper as if several voices were speaking at the same time, but too low to distinguish words. He slowly approached the crack in the window and looked. Under the weak moonlight, 3 silhouettes of men appeared standing a few meters from the house. They weren't moving, weren't trying to enter. They just stayed there watching him in silence. The scene chilled him deeply. Those men weren't strangers who had gotten lost in the hills. They weren't exploring. They were waiting for him as if they wanted him to take the next step. At dawn, with his eyes red from lack of sleep, Jake gathered courage and decided to follow the tracks they had left in the earth. With careful steps, he advanced through the hill, guided by footprints that sank into the soft ground. The tracks led him to a clearing hidden among scrub oaks, where the earth was turned over as if someone had dug graves. There, upon pushing aside the dry branches, he found more nests like the one he had found days before. But these were different. They were complete, braided with the same dark fiber, and inside them were pieces of clothing, worn shoes, and something that froze his blood, strands of human hair caught between the ropes. Jake stepped back with his stomach churning, realizing this wasn't the work of nature or animals, but of men who had used human remains to build their hideouts. The hill kept a macabre secret, and now he was witness to it. The sound of an engine pulled him from his thoughts. From the clearing, he could see through the trees the same gray truck parked in the gap. The men got out with bags on their backs and dragged them toward the clearing where he was hiding. With his heart beating hard against his ribs, Jake hid behind a bush and watched as they opened the bags. What he saw left him breathless, human parts wrapped in dirty cloths that they threw indifferently inside the nests. Then one of them lit a lantern and checked the ground, as if making sure no one was spying on them. Jake held his breath, sweating cold, begging the earth to swallow him at that moment. He realized with horror that they weren't nests in the natural sense. They were hideouts, trophies, altars built by men whose identity dissolved in darkness. When the men marched away, Jake staggered out of his hiding place. Never in his life had he felt such weight in his soul. He had found the truth, but that truth was bigger than him. A monster he couldn't defeat. He thought only of going to the authorities, but immediately remembered stories from the village. Complaints that never prospered, men who disappeared after talking too much, police who suddenly became accomplices of silence. If he spoke, they would silence him. If he remained silent, he would take the secret to his grave. For the first time, Jake felt a deep hatred for his own powerlessness, against the injustice of living in a corner where human life seemed to have no value. That night, upon returning to his house covered in boards and shadows, he sat in front of the stove with an empty gaze. The bag was still under the table, exhaling that unbearable smell, and now he knew for certain where it came from. He couldn't burn it, couldn't bury it, couldn't get rid of it, because it was proof of what he had seen, and yet keeping it condemned him to live hunted, trapped in a circle from which there was no escape. In the midst of silence, he understood that his destiny wasn't to solve the mystery, but to endure it, and in that sacrifice alone, he also knew that although no one would recognize it, he had done what few would dare to do, look directly at a truth that most people preferred to ignore. The days following the discovery in the clearing were the longest of Jake's life. Each dawn greeted him with tired eyes, bent back and tense soul, as if he carried a secret too heavy for one man alone. And yet, something began to change. The neighbors, who had always avoided passing by his land, began approaching discreetly. A widow left him tortillas wrapped in a handkerchief without saying a word, just with a look that spoke of gratitude and fear. A young boy, son of another farmer, offered to help him better cover his windows. Old Henry visited him again, and this time not with warnings, but with a gesture of silent respect. It was then that Jake understood that even though no one said it aloud, everyone knew what he had seen, and his resilience, his refusal to flee, made them feel less alone. His personal sacrifice, that life cornered by fear, began to become an invisible wall that also protected others. One morning, while checking the traps in the field, he found something unexpected. On a flat stone was a leather bag closed with a knot. He opened it carefully and discovered inside provisions: beans, corn, a little coffee. There was no note or sign of who had left it, but it was clear it was a gesture from someone in the community. Jake looked at that small gift with teary eyes, understanding he wasn't completely alone, that his silent sacrifice had awakened a form of hidden solidarity among the neighbors. That anonymous help gave him a breath of strength, as if reminding him there were still reasons to keep resisting, even if the world outside seemed to crumble in shadows. The rumor began to grow without him seeking it. In town, people began talking in low voices about Jake, the farmer who had found something in the hills and now lived locked in his house, neither yielding nor fleeing. Some saw him as a madman, but others as a man who dared to look where no one wanted to look. It didn't take long before a group of men from the community approached his land at nightfall, not to confront him, but to sit silently near the corral, as if their mere presence were a shield. No one asked him for details. No one mentioned the nest or the gray truck, but the message was clear. They were recognizing him as a point of resistance, a symbol of dignity amid fear. That night, for the first time in weeks, Jake managed to sleep a few hours undisturbed. He dreamed of his mother, who watched him smiling from the doorway of the house with a calm he hadn't felt in a long time. Upon waking to the rooster's crow, he went out to the patio and breathed the fresh dawn air. The hill was still there, dark and silent. The mysteries remained unsolved, but there was something different in his core. He no longer felt alone. The community silently surrounded him, recognizing his courage, his stubbornness to stay standing when the easiest thing would have been to flee. The real reward didn't come in the form of money or authority, but in something deeper: the respect and gratitude of his people. Those who had always lowered their gaze when talking about the hill now raised their eyes when meeting him. Those who before remained absolutely silent now gave him a brief greeting, but full of recognition. Jake, without having planned it, had become an invisible guardian of his people, the man who bore the weight of fear so others would remember they could still resist. And although he knew the threat still lurked, he also understood he had achieved something no one could take away from him: the dignity of a farmer who, without meaning to, inspired his people not to give up. Time passed, and although the gray truck was seen again some nights in the gap, they never again approached Jake's house directly. He knew they were watching him, that they hadn't forgotten, but he also understood something had changed in the dynamics of fear. People were no longer completely silent. The neighbors, inspired by his resistance, had begun reinforcing their own houses, sharing food among themselves, talking in low voices about what was happening on the hill. No one named names, no one pointed out culprits, but the simple fact of not living with drooped shoulders was a victory. And that small transformation was born from the silent sacrifice of a farmer who refused to flee. Jake didn't recognize it as heroism, but as natural stubbornness, a foolishness that came from his father's blood and his mother's patience. Without meaning to, he had given his people a lesson. As weeks passed, the neighbors began visiting him more frequently. Some brought seeds, others helped fix his corral, and even the children who had once watched him from afar now ran to play near his land. Jake, accustomed to solitude, was surprised to feel companionship as a balm. He discovered that true strength wasn't in nailing boards or wielding a machete, but in the simple act of getting up, of not bending even when everything around him tried to break him. That certainty filled him with calm, and every night while watching the sun hide behind the hill, he silently thanked having found meaning, even amid fear. The sacrifice was worth it because he was no longer bearing it alone. The weight of the secret was now shared among everyone in the community's collective conscience. One afternoon, while planting corn in newly dug furrows, he felt someone's presence behind him. It was old Henry with his cane and tired gaze, but with a smile Jake had never seen before. "You did it, boy," he said, leaning on the fence. "You didn't defeat them, but you took away what they needed most." Silence. Jake remained motionless with the hoe in his hand, letting those words penetrate his heart. There was no glory, no absolute triumph, but he had achieved something much deeper. He had awakened his people's voice, and in that awakening was the seed of a different future. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace, he thought about everything he had lived through, the discovery of the nest, the shadows that surrounded his house, the fear that almost broke him, and the unexpected strength he had found in his own resistance. He understood that not all battles are meant to be won. Some are meant only to persevere, to set an example, so others have courage and continue. The lesson of his story wasn't about the mystery of the hill or the men who roamed it, but about the dignity that arises when a farmer decides not to give up. His silent sacrifice had blossomed into shared hope, and that was more powerful than any weapon. Thus, under a sky covered with stars, with the hill breathing in the distance and the neighbors now close, Jake understood that life in the countryside, though hard and lonely, holds a greatness that few know how to see. It's not about wealth or power, but about resilience, faith, and humility. The final lesson was clear. A simple, poor, forgotten man can become a beacon for his community, not because he defeats darkness, but because he dares to stand before it. And in that silent stubbornness lies true victory.